Today we're making a steel pallet for our Brobo cold saw. That way it'll be easily movable within our shop. I'm actually not sure how this will turn out, but let's see how it goes. The steel pallet is going to be made out of 2.5 by 2.5 square tubing. It's tricky to move the square tubing around as it's fairly heavy. Here the square tubing is ready to be cut, and I have a shorter section as well. The pallet I'm going to be making is a square 36 by 36. I cut 31-inch sections for the center and chose not to miter the corners. For the center of the pallet I used some scrapped rectangular tubing that are 31 inches long. Here's how the pallet looks laid out with the 6 center sections. There's also a 7th section with the 2 shorter tubes that are in the back that are stacked, but I have to weld those later. The corners of the pallet aren't mitered, so I can store some rebar inside. Getting rid of mill scale is always a chore. I start welding the pallet here, but I actually messed up because I forgot to clamp it down and it came out crooked. I use my machinist clamps to bolt the pallet down and make it flat. Now I flip the square over and prep the other side to get ready for welding. Since the square tubing actually has rounded corners, there's quite a gap that you have to make up with a weld. At this point, the top and bottom of the square is all welded together. To tackle any project such as this, it really helps to have the proper tools. Our JMR table, diamide clamps, C-clamps, and genuine metal squares really makes fabrication much easier. I stood the square up to make the inside corners easier to reach. I prepped the inside corners and then I welded them together and also hit the outsides of the square. The white tube you see on my back is a fresh air respiratory system, so I don't have to breathe in all the fumes. I rotate the square to work on other 2 corners. Also cautious because this thing's getting really heavy. I bolted the square down with my machinist clamps to make sure it's flat, and also that it doesn't fall on my head and knock me out. Cleared out the center pile of tools so I can lay out the floor section of the pallet. Here I number the tubing and mark where I'm going to grind off the mill scale. It's important to take off all the mill scale or else it leads to porosity. Steel welds best to steel and nothing else. I lay out the floor of the pallet and use machinist clamps to bolt down everything flat. Here's the progress so far, and the pallet is taking shape quite nicely. The gaps from the rectangular tubing to the square tubing are really tight, so this should be fairly easy to weld. It should have been easy to weld, but I was having porosity issues, either from the wrong torch angle or lack of gas coverage. Lack of prep as well. You can tell from all the sparks flying out. The welds are still strong though, and you live and you learn. Here I prepped the 24-inch sections to get welded together. I made a quick jig to make sure everything is flat as possible. Here's a cool shot. I really love welding. The jig made it real easy to keep things straight. Here I cut down the 48-inch to a 31-inch. I prepped it and it fit in quite nicely with some persuasion. Here I welded in the 7th section. These welds didn't come out too bad. I flip the pallet over and get it ready for welding on the backside. You can see the nice big gaps due to the rounded sides of the square tubing. With a standard aluminum cup, I would have had trouble welding these together, but I'm going to try a Furic Fupa 12 cup and hopefully that gives me better results. I also thought about welding just the sides of the tubes, but welding the bottom is much easier and it'll be stronger as the weld bead is much longer. Here I use the Furic Fupa 12 cup and it works really well due to all the argon gas shielding that it throws out. You can see the lack of sparks, which means no porosity in the welds. That's all from the argon gas shielding that's properly covering the weld puddle. I really like how the welds with the Fupa cup turned out. Too bad you can't see it because it's on the underside of the steel pallet. Here are a couple of my welds. They close up the gap quite nicely and should be super strong. Here's the Fupa 12 cup and I'm using a 2% lanthanated 3/32 tungsten. Now I'm grinding on the bottom of the pallet to prep it for the feet that elevated off the ground. I got some cubes from the square tubing. I used a 27/64 drill bit to punch some holes and did this for all 4 of the cube bases. These are going to be the base for my leveling feet. I then used my 1/2-inch tap to cut some threads, and this is how the leveling feet turned out. The extra holes are where the threads came out all crooked. I also got some 1/2-inch nuts to weld onto the bases. They're there so the bolt has more threads to grab onto and provides more strength. Here I weld the leveling feet to the bottom of the steel pallet. I need them because the concrete slab of my floor isn't 100% level. Here's the finished product and it looks pretty good. The leveling feet are welded on 3 sides and it should be pretty strong. I'm careful with placing the steel pallet on the floor as this thing is super heavy. With the pallet jack it's easily movable. Here's the steel pallet, time to drill it. I placed the cold saw stand onto the steel pallet to mark it out. Then I drilled the holes for the 1/2-inch bolts. I drilled the bottom of the pallet bigger so it can be accessed with a socket. Here I bolt the cold saw stand down to the steel pallet. I used nylon lock nuts so they won't get loose. With the cold saw stand bolted down, it makes for a nice, heavy, stable base. Now it's time to bolt the cold saw on top of the stand. I moved the Challenger out of the way to access the rotary lift to lift up the cold saw because it's really heavy. Here I attempt to lift up the cold saw, but I ended up getting nowhere and wasn't able to lift it off the wooden pallet. I get the bright idea of using straps to lift up the cold saw. It's kind of sketchy, but it worked. Don't try this at home, kids. Haha. With a little more effort, I was able to align the cold saw and bolt it onto its stand. So now you see our Brobo cold saw finally off the floor and mounted onto its new home. In order not to topple when moving, I cut a piece of rebar to act as a safety strap under the pallet jack. The stand's done. Whew, that was a lot of work. That's it for now. We're Riley's Productions. Catch you guys later.